The ceramic plate slipped from Emily's trembling fingers, shattering against the grimy diner floor as another wave of exhaustion crashed through her body. Her knees buckled slightly, one hand gripping the edge of the booth to steady herself, while the other pressed against her chest, where her grandmother's pendant burned like a coal against her skin. The fluorescent lights above flickered with their usual dying wheeze, casting sickly shadows across the empty restaurant that had become her prison of endless double shifts. "Mom, you okay?" Jake's voice cut through the fog in her head, small and worried from where he sat at the corner table, homework scattered around his 8-year-old frame like fallen leaves. She forced a smile that felt like cracked glass. "Just tired, baby. Finish your math." But tired didn't cover it. Bone-deep exhaustion had settled into her marrow weeks ago, the kind that sleep couldn't touch. 3 jobs, unpaid bills stacked like accusations on her kitchen counter, and Jake's growing questions about why they lived in the shadows of Netherton's vampire district, where rent was cheap and hope was cheaper. The pendant her grandmother had left her seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat lately, a constant reminder of the old woman's cryptic warnings about their family's gift. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Emily's stomach dropped. No one came to Sal's diner after midnight unless they were lost or dangerous. In Netherton's vampire quarter, both categories often overlapped with deadly consequences. The woman who entered moved like smoke given form, her pale skin luminous against the harsh lighting. Designer clothes that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent hung perfectly on her willowy frame, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The woman's steps faltered, one manicured hand pressed against her side, where dark stains spread across pristine white silk. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice carrying an accent Emily couldn't place. "I need help." Every instinct screamed at Emily to stay behind the counter, to grab Jake and run. This was vampire territory, and vampires didn't ask for help unless the situation was beyond desperate. But the woman's legs gave out, and she crumpled to her knees on the checkered linoleum, blood pooling beneath her like spilled wine. Jake's pencil clattered to his table. "Mom?" "Stay there," Emily commanded, her voice sharper than intended. Her feet moved without permission, carrying her around the counter toward the dying woman. Up close, she could see the ethereal beauty that marked the vampire nobility, the kind of face that graced the society pages Jake sometimes glimpsed in discarded newspapers. This wasn't some street-level vampire. This was someone important. "My son," the woman gasped, her eyes finding Emily's with surprising intensity. "Tell him the Morvain line dies with honor." The pendant around Emily's neck erupted in heat so sudden and fierce she cried out. The woman's hand shot up, fingers closing around Emily's wrist with supernatural strength, and the world exploded in golden light. Power surged through Emily's body like lightning through water, flowing from some deep reservoir she'd never known existed. The woman's grip burned against her skin, but she couldn't pull away, couldn't break the connection as energy poured out of her and into the dying vampire. The pendant's glow intensified until Jake's worried shouts seemed to come from underwater. The woman's wounds began to close. Color returned to her pallid cheeks. Her breath steadied from ragged gasps to smooth inhalations, and her eyes widened with something that looked like reverence mixed with terror. "Impossible," she breathed, sitting up with fluid grace. Her fingers traced the pendant's outline through Emily's uniform shirt. The healing line. After all these centuries. Her gaze snapped to Emily's face with predatory focus. "What is your name, child?" Emily tried to step back, but her legs felt like water. The energy drain had left her hollow, shaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do." The woman rose to her feet, no trace of injury remaining. "Your blood knows. Your touch knows. That pendant has been waiting for you to awaken." She smiled, revealing elongated canines that gleamed in the fluorescent light. I am Queen Seraphina Morvain, and you, my dear, have just saved the vampire throne. The words hit Emily like physical blows. Queen, vampire, throne. She thought of Jake behind her, of their tiny apartment with its broken locks and overdue notices, of the life she'd built on the margins of a world she'd never understood. I'm nobody, she whispered. Just a waitress. I don't have any power. Queen Seraphina's laugh was like silver bells wrapped in velvet. Too late for denials, little healer. You've revealed yourself, and in doing so, sealed both our fates. She moved toward the diner's windows, her reflection ghostly in the glass. My enemies poisoned me tonight, left me to die in the gutter like a common criminal. But you've undone their work with a touch. Emily's hands shook as she looked down at her palms, searching for some sign of the power that had flowed through them. This is insane. People can't heal vampires. People can't. But you're not merely people. The Queen's voice carried centuries of authority. You're descended from the Luminous line, the human healers who once served as bridges between our worlds. We thought your kind extinct. Her eyes glittered with something between hunger and hope. My son will be very interested to meet you. The diner door burst open, and 3 figures in black filled the entrance. Not human, Emily realized with crystalline clarity. The way they moved, the way the air itself seemed to bend around them, marked them as vampire nobility. Their eyes swept the scene, taking in the Queen's restored health and Emily's trembling form. Your Majesty, the tallest one spoke, his voice a low rumble. We felt the healing pulse across the entire district. Is she the one? Queen Seraphina nodded slowly. She is. Prepare the carriage. We're bringing her to the palace. No. The word tore from Emily's throat. She spun toward Jake, who watched with wide, frightened eyes. I have a son. I can't just leave. You have no choice, the Queen said gently, but steel underlined her tone. Your power makes you invaluable, child. And in my world, invaluable things are either protected or eliminated. I prefer protection, but my enemies will choose differently. One of the vampires stepped forward, his movement liquid and threatening. Emily's instinct was to run, to grab Jake and disappear into Netherton's maze of back alleys. But the pendant still burned against her skin, and she could feel something awakening in her blood, something that recognized these creatures not as predators, but as ancient allies. Bring the boy, Queen Seraphina commanded. They're a package deal now. Emily's world tilted on its axis as Jake's small hand slipped into hers, his trust absolute even in the face of impossibility. The palace's obsidian walls rose before them like a monument to eternal night, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as the carriage wheels ground to a halt on black gravel that sparkled with what looked like crushed diamonds. Jake pressed against her side, his small body trembling despite his attempts to appear brave, and she wrapped her arm around him as Queen Seraphina swept from the carriage with regal grace restored. Welcome to the Morvain stronghold, the Queen murmured, her voice carrying across the courtyard where shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Your new home. Home. The word felt foreign on Emily's tongue as she helped Jake down from the ornate carriage, his sneakers looking painfully out of place against the polished stone. This wasn't home. Home was their cramped apartment with its leaking ceiling and neighbors who minded their own business. Home was Jake's drawings taped to the refrigerator and the smell of instant coffee in the morning. This towering fortress of glass and shadow felt like a beautiful prison. They were escorted through corridors lined with portraits of vampire nobility spanning centuries, their painted eyes seeming to track Emily's movement with predatory interest. Jake's grip tightened on her hand with each step, and she could feel his fear radiating through their connection like heat from a fever. The pendant around her neck had cooled, but still pulsed with an irregular rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. The king is in the healing chamber, Queen Seraphina explained as they climbed a spiral staircase carved from what appeared to be solid obsidian. He's been maintaining a vigil there for weeks, trying every remedy in our archives to counteract the poison that nearly claimed me tonight. Her voice hardened. The same poison that flows through our court like a plague. Emily stumbled on the stairs, her exhaustion catching up with her in waves. The healing had drained something vital from her core, leaving her feeling hollow and stretched thin. I don't understand any of this. Yesterday I was worried about Jake's school clothes, and now you're telling me I'm some kind of magical healer? Magic is a human word, the Queen replied without breaking stride. What flows through you is older than magic, deeper than power. It's purpose, child. The purpose your bloodline was born to serve. They reached a set of double doors carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the torchlight. Queen Seraphina paused, her hand resting on the handle, and for the first time since the diner, Emily saw vulnerability flicker across her perfect features. My son has carried the weight of our kingdom since he was barely older than your boy, she said quietly. The poison that nearly killed me tonight has been spreading through our people for months. We've lost 17 nobles, 3 council members, and countless citizens. David has been searching desperately for a cure while trying to identify the traitor in our midst. She turned to meet Emily's eyes. You may be our only hope. The doors opened into a chamber that took Emily's breath away. The ceiling soared 40 feet above them, painted with constellations that moved slowly across the dark expanse like a living sky. Medical equipment that looked centuries ahead of anything Emily had seen, mixed with ancient artifacts and leather-bound books, stacked on every available surface. The air hummed with an energy that made her skin prickle. At the center of the room, hunched over a massive desk covered in charts and vials, sat a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. His dark hair fell across his face as he worked, and even from across the room, Emily could see the exhaustion that carved deep lines around his eyes. He looked up when they entered, and the relief that flooded his features as he saw his mother was so profound it made Emily's chest ache. Mother! He was across the room in an instant, moving with that fluid vampire grace, his hands hovering over Queen Seraphina as if he couldn't quite believe she was whole. The court physician said the poison had reached your heart. They said there was nothing more they could do. There wasn't, the Queen replied, placing a gentle hand on her son's cheek. Not through conventional means. David, I want you to meet Emily. She gestured toward where Emily stood frozen in the doorway, Jake pressed against her legs like a shield. She's the one who healed me. King David's gaze shifted to Emily, and the intensity of his stare made her knees weak. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray shot through with silver, and ancient beyond his years. He studied her face, her posture, the way she unconsciously shielded Jake, and something flickered in his expression that looked like recognition mixed with disbelief. You're human, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of old nobility and careful education. Humans can't channel healing energy into vampire physiology. The species barrier makes it impossible. That's what I told her, Emily managed, finding her voice despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. But your mother seems to think I'm something else. David moved closer, and Emily caught his scent, something like sandalwood and midnight rain that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his gaze dropping to where her grandmother's pendant rested against her collarbone. His entire body went rigid. Where did you get that? Emily's hand flew to the pendant protectively. It belonged to my grandmother. She left it to me when she died. What was her name? The urgency in David's voice made Jake whimper and press closer to Emily's side. Rose. Rose Blackwood. The name felt heavy on her tongue, weighted with secrets she'd never understood. She used to tell me stories about healing people, but I thought they were just fairy tales. David and Queen Seraphina exchanged a look loaded with meaning Emily couldn't decipher. The king ran his hands through his hair, leaving it disheveled, and began pacing the length of the chamber with restless energy. Rose Blackwood disappeared 70 years ago, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. She was the last known member of the Luminous Healers, a human bloodline that served as mediators between vampire and human worlds for over 1,000 years. When she vanished, we assumed the line had ended. Emily's legs gave out, and she sank into the nearest chair, pulling Jake onto her lap. That's impossible. My grandmother was just a woman who liked garden parties and baking cookies. She wasn't some mystical healer. She was hiding, Queen Seraphina said gently. The last great war between our peoples drove the luminous healers underground. Too many of them died trying to maintain peace between species that had forgotten how to coexist. She moved to a bookshelf and withdrew an ancient leather tome, its pages yellowed with age. But the power doesn't die, Emily. It sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken. David stopped his pacing and knelt beside Emily's chair, bringing himself to eye level with Jake. "What's your name, brave one?" Jake looked up at his mother for permission before answering in a small voice. "Jake. Jake." David smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face, making him look younger and somehow warmer. "Do you know your mother is very special?" Jake nodded solemnly. "She fixes everything. When I get hurt, she puts her hands on it and it feels better." Emily's breath caught. She thought of all the scraped knees and bumped heads, the way Jake's pain seemed to ease under her touch faster than it should have. She'd attributed it to Mother's intuition, the power of comfort and love. But now, with the pendant still warm against her skin and the memory of Queen Seraphina's wounds closing under her touch, she began to understand that her grandmother's fairy tales might have been something else entirely. "I need to see what you can do," David said, rising to his feet. His expression had shifted back to the focused intensity of a king dealing with crisis. "The poison in our system isn't just killing individuals. It's designed to corrupt our entire species, to turn us into something monstrous even by vampire standards." He led them to a section of the chamber Emily hadn't noticed before, where several vampires lay on beds that looked more like medical examination tables. Their skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and dark veins mapped their bodies like twisted rivers. One of them, a young woman who couldn't have been turned much older than Emily herself, was writhing in obvious agony. "This is what the poison does in its advanced stages," David explained, his voice clinical but his eyes full of pain. "It turns our natural bloodlust into an uncontrollable hunger that can only be satisfied by human suffering. We've had to restrain them to keep them from harming themselves or others." Emily stood at the foot of the nearest bed, staring at the suffering vampire, and felt something stir deep in her chest. The same warmth that had flowed through her in the diner began to build again, centered around her grandmother's pendant but spreading outward through her entire body. "I don't know how to control it," she whispered. "What if I make it worse?" "You won't." David's voice held absolute certainty. "The luminous healers were created to bridge the gap between species. Your touch can't harm what it's meant to heal." Emily reached out with trembling fingers, her hand hovering over the suffering vampire's forehead. The moment her skin made contact, the pendant blazed with golden light, and power rushed through her like a river breaking through a dam. The vampire's thrashing stopped, her breathing eased, and the gray pallor began to fade from her skin. But this time, Emily felt something else in the healing energy. Darkness, corruption. A foreign presence that fought against her touch with malevolent intelligence. She gasped and jerked her hand away, the connection severed so abruptly that she staggered backward. "There's something else," she said, her voice shaking. "Something in the poison that doesn't want to be healed." It felt almost alive. David's expression darkened. "That's impossible. Poison doesn't have consciousness. This one does." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the chamber. And it recognized me. It knew what I was trying to do, and it fought back. Queen Seraphina closed the ancient tome with a sharp snap. Then we're dealing with something far more dangerous than we realized. This isn't just an attempt to destabilize our kingdom. Someone is trying to corrupt the entire vampire species using a poison that can think, adapt, and resist healing. The implications hit Emily like physical blows. If she was truly the last of the Luminous Healers, if her power was the only thing that could counteract this intelligent poison, then she'd become the most valuable and dangerous person in two worlds. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Jake tugged on her shirt. "Mom, I'm scared." She looked down at her son, at his wide eyes full of trust and confusion, and felt something break inside her chest. He was 8 years old. He should be worried about homework and playground politics, not ancient bloodlines and supernatural poisons. She'd brought him into this world of shadows and danger, and now there might be no way out. "I know, baby," she whispered, lifting him into her arms despite her exhaustion. "I'm scared too." David approached them slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peaceful intent. "The palace has secure quarters where you'll both be safe while we figure this out. You have my word as king that no harm will come to either of you under my protection." Emily met his eyes, searching for deception or hidden agenda, but found only weary sincerity. "And if I can't heal your people? If this poison is too strong for whatever power I'm supposed to have? Then we'll find another way," he replied without hesitation. "But Emily, you saved my mother's life tonight. You eased that vampire's suffering with a touch. Whatever this poison is, whatever intelligence drives it, you're the first hope we've had in months." Hope. The word felt foreign after so many years of just surviving, of scraping by on the margins of a world that had never seemed to have room for people like her. But as she looked around the chamber, at the suffering vampires and the young king who carried the weight of his people's survival, she began to understand that her grandmother's pendant hadn't just awakened her power. It had awakened her purpose. Queen Seraphina moved to a window that looked out over the sprawling vampire city, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars. "There's something else you need to know," she said quietly. "The poison isn't random. Each victim has been chosen specifically, targeted for their influence and importance to our society. Whoever is behind this knows our people intimately." "You think it's someone inside your court," Emily said. It wasn't a question. "I know it is." David's voice carried bitter certainty. The timing, the precision, the knowledge required to create something that specifically targets vampire physiology while remaining undetectable until it's almost too late. This is the work of someone who has intimate access to our society and our secrets. Emily thought of her small apartment, of the life she'd built through sheer determination and countless sacrifices. It felt like something from another world now, a simple existence that had been shattered the moment she'd touched Queen Seraphina's hand. But as she held Jake close and felt the pendant's steady pulse against her chest, she realized that maybe that simple life had always been an illusion. Maybe she'd been hiding from her true nature just as her grandmother had hidden from hers. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made them all turn toward the door. David's posture shifted instantly from weary king to predatory guardian, and Emily felt the change in the room's atmosphere like a drop in temperature. "The court has been summoned," Queen Seraphina announced, reading some signal Emily had missed. "Word of my recovery has spread, and they'll want to see proof that the healing was genuine." David's jaw tightened. "Which means they'll want to see her." Emily's stomach clenched as she realized the implications. If the traitor was someone in the vampire court, then appearing before them would be like painting a target on her back. But if she refused, They'd know she was more than just a lucky human who'd stumbled into healing powers. "What if I can't do it again?" she whispered. "What if the healing was just a fluke?" David stepped closer, and she caught that intoxicating scent again, the one that made her pulse quicken, despite everything. "Then we'll face that together. But Emily, I need you to understand something. The moment you healed my mother, you became part of this world whether you wanted to or not. The only question now is whether you'll stand with us or become a victim of whoever is trying to destroy us." The pendant grew warm against her skin, and Emily felt that strange stirring in her blood again, the sense of something ancient awakening after a long sleep. She looked at Jake, at David, at Queen Seraphina, and realized that her choice had been made the moment she'd reached out to help a dying woman in a dingy diner. She was no longer just Emily the waitress, struggling to make ends meet. She was Emily Blackwood, last of the Luminous Healers, and the fate of two species might very well rest in her trembling hands. The court chamber stretched before them like a cathedral of shadows, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness while dozens of vampire nobles arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the marble floor. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped into the center of that ring. Jake's small hand clutched in hers, Queen Seraphina and David flanking them like sentinels. The pendant burned against her chest, its glow barely contained by her shirt's thin fabric. "Behold!" Queen Seraphina's voice rang through the chamber, commanding and clear. "The healer who restored life to dying flesh, who drew poison from royal blood with nothing but her touch." Whispers rippled through the assembled court like wind through dead leaves. Emily caught fragments of their conversations, words in languages she didn't recognize mixed with English, spoken in accents that spanned centuries. But she felt their scrutiny like physical weight. Dozens of predatory gazes dissecting every detail of her appearance, searching for weakness or deception. Lord Matthias Blackthorne stepped forward from the circle, his silver hair gleaming in the torchlight and his pale eyes fixed on Emily with calculating interest. She recognized him from the portraits lining the corridors, one of the oldest members of the vampire nobility, his influence spanning generations of court politics. "Remarkable," he murmured, circling them slowly. "A human who can channel healing energy into vampire physiology. Such a thing hasn't been seen since the Luminous Wars." His gaze dropped to where the pendant's glow was becoming impossible to hide. "Unless, of course, she isn't entirely human." "She is what she is," David said sharply, his voice carrying royal authority. "And what she has saved my mother's life when all our court physicians had given up hope." Lord Matthias smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers. "Indeed, but one must wonder, Your Majesty, how convenient it is that this miraculous healer appeared just when the poison reached your mother's heart. Almost as if someone knew exactly when their services would be needed." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Emily felt the court's attention shift, becoming hungrier, more dangerous. Jake pressed closer to her side, his fear radiating through their connection in waves that made her chest ache. "What are you implying, Lord Matthias?" Queen Seraphina's voice could have frozen fire. "Nothing treasonous, Your Majesty. Simply observing that coincidences of this magnitude rarely occur naturally." He gestured toward Emily with elegant disdain. "Perhaps our mysterious healer would be willing to demonstrate her abilities for the court? After all, if she truly possesses the power of the Luminous Healers, she should be able to heal any vampire affliction, not just convenient cases of poisoning." Emily's mouth went dry. The challenge was clear, and she could feel the trap closing around her like jaws. If she refused, they'd assume she was a fraud, or worse, a conspirator. If she attempted to heal and failed, Jake would be left defenseless in a court full of predators. But if she succeeded? "I'll do it," she said quietly, the words leaving her mouth before her rational mind could stop them. Lord Matthias's smile widened. "Excellent. Lady Cordelia, if you would step forward. A vampire emerged from the circle, moving with the careful grace of someone managing constant pain. Dark veins mapped her pale skin like spiderwebs, and her eyes held the glazed look of advanced poisoning that Emily had seen in the healing chamber. But there was something else. Something that made Emily's skin crawl as the vampire approached. The pendant erupted in heat so sudden and fierce that Emily gasped, stumbling backward. The sensation wasn't the warm stirring of healing power awakening. This was warning, sharp and urgent, like touching a live wire. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her hand rising instinctively to cover the pendant. "Wrong?" Lord Matthias tilted his head with predatory curiosity. "Lady Cordelia suffers from the same poison that nearly claimed our beloved queen. Surely, if your power is genuine, healing her should present no difficulty." Emily stared at Lady Cordelia, and understanding crashed through her like a physical blow. The vampire's poisoning wasn't accidental. It wasn't even entirely natural. The dark intelligence she'd sensed in the healing chamber was here, concentrated and waiting, using Lady Cordelia as a vessel to test Emily's abilities and learn how to counter them. "She's not just poisoned," Emily said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. "She's been turned into a weapon." The court erupted in shocked murmurs, but Emily barely heard them. Her attention was fixed on Lady Cordelia, on the way the vampire's glazed eyes suddenly sharpened with malevolent intelligence that wasn't entirely her own. "Clever little healer," Lady Cordelia spoke, but the voice that emerged was layered with harmonics that made Emily's teeth ache. "But not clever enough." The vampire lunged forward with inhuman speed, her fingers extended like claws, aiming directly for Jake's throat. Emily moved without thought, her body responding to maternal instinct deeper than reason. She threw herself between them, her hands coming up to catch Lady Cordelia's wrists, and the pendant blazed with golden light that filled the entire chamber. Power erupted from Emily like a dam bursting, but this wasn't the controlled healing energy she'd channeled before. This was raw, primal, the accumulated potential of a bloodline stretching back 1,000 years, finally unleashed without restraint or caution. The golden light poured into Lady Cordelia, and the dark intelligence inhabiting her body screamed in harmonics that shattered crystal goblets throughout the chamber. Emily felt the foreign presence writhing under her touch, fighting against the healing energy with desperate fury. It was ancient, she realized with crystal clarity. Older than the vampire courts. Older than the wars between species. Something that had been waiting, planning, using the poison not just to kill, but to corrupt, to transform the vampire nobility into vessels for its own twisted consciousness. "Get out!" Emily commanded, her voice resonating with power that made the chamber's stone walls vibrate. "Get out of her body! Get out of this kingdom! Get out of this world!" The presence fought harder, sending tendrils of corruption through Lady Cordelia's system like black lightning. But Emily's power followed those tendrils, burning them away with golden fire that left no shadow untouched. She felt the moment the intelligence, realized it couldn't win, felt its rage and frustration as it began to withdraw from Lady Cordelia's body like smoke fleeing flame. But before it retreated completely, it spoke one final message directly into Emily's mind, its voice like grinding glass. "The healer awakens, but awakening brings attention. They know you exist now, little light, and they are coming." Lady Cordelia collapsed as the presence abandoned her, her body convulsing as the artificial poisoning burned away under Emily's continued touch. Color returned to her skin, the dark veins faded, and her breathing steadied into natural rhythm. But Emily barely noticed the successful healing. Her mind was reeling from the entity's final words, from the implications of what she'd just faced. She'd been wrong about the traitor in the court. There was no vampire conspirator working to destroy their kingdom from within. The threat was something far older and more dangerous, something that had been using vampire nobles as unwilling hosts while it gathered strength and information. And now it knew she existed. Now it would come for her directly. Emily released Lady Cordelia's wrists and staggered backward, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The golden light faded from the chamber, leaving them in flickering torchlight that seemed dim after such brilliance. Jake was at her side instantly, his small arms wrapping around her waist in fierce protection. "Mom, your hands are shaking." She looked down at her palms, expecting to see some sign of the power that had flowed through them, but found only her own familiar skin marked with calluses from years of waitressing. Yet she could still feel the energy humming in her veins, no longer dormant but fully awakened, waiting for her command. The court had fallen into stunned silence. Lady Cordelia sat up slowly, her eyes clear and free of the glazed confusion that had marked her since the poisoning began. She stared at Emily with something approaching reverence, then dropped to one knee in a gesture of profound respect. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice her own again. I felt it inside me, controlling my thoughts, my actions. I couldn't fight it. One by one, the other nobles began to kneel, their earlier skepticism replaced by recognition of what they'd witnessed. Emily had done more than heal poison. She'd exorcised an ancient evil from one of their own, had faced down an intelligence that had been manipulating their entire kingdom from within. Only Lord Matthias remained standing, his pale eyes fixed on Emily with an expression she couldn't read. "The Luminous Healers have returned," he said quietly. "May the old gods preserve us all." David stepped to Emily's side, his presence solid and reassuring in the aftermath of power that had left her feeling hollow. "The court has seen the truth of your gift," he said formally. "You are under the protection of the crown, as is your son." But Emily barely heard him. Her mind was still processing the entity's final warning, the certainty in its mental voice that others of its kind knew about her awakening. She thought of her small apartment, of the normal life she'd been living just hours before, and realized with crushing finality that there would be no going back. She was the last of the Luminous Healers, and ancient enemies thought extinct were stirring in response to her awakening power. Queen Seraphina approached them, her expression mixing maternal concern with royal pragmatism. "The healing chamber has been prepared for your use," she said gently. "There are 17 more nobles suffering from varying stages of poisoning, and now that we know the true nature of our enemy, speed is essential." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a crown she'd never asked to wear. But as she looked around the chamber, at the kneeling nobles and the hope flickering in their eyes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not the desperate scramble to survive that had defined her life since Jake's birth, but genuine purpose that reached beyond herself and her immediate needs. She'd spent 8 years believing she was nobody special, just another single mother struggling to make ends meet in a world that barely noticed her existence. Now she understood that her grandmother's pendant hadn't just been family jewelry. It had been a beacon, waiting for the moment when Emily's power would be needed most. Rose Blackwood hadn't disappeared 70 years ago. She'd gone into hiding, had raised a family in the human world while keeping the luminous bloodline alive for this moment. "The other poison nobles," Emily said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Are they all infected with the same presence I just removed?" David shook his head. "The poisoning presents differently in each case. Some show the gray pallor and dark veins. Others experience blood madness or complete cognitive breakdown. We hadn't realized they were connected until tonight." "They're all connected," Emily said with absolute certainty. "That thing I just faced, it's been experimenting with different ways to corrupt vampire physiology, using your people as test subjects while it perfected its methods." She thought of the intelligence's final words, of other entities knowing about her awakening. If this had been just one of many, If there were others like it preparing to move against both vampire and human worlds, then healing the poison nobles was only the beginning. Jake tugged on her shirt again. "Mom, are we going to stay here?" Emily looked down at her son, at his trusting eyes and sleep-rumpled hair, and felt her heart break a little. He deserved better than this. Deserved a childhood free from ancient evils and supernatural politics. But as she met his gaze, she saw something that surprised her. Not fear, not confusion, acceptance. As if some part of him had always known this moment would come, had been waiting for her to step into the role she'd been born to fill. "For now," she said quietly, "until we figure out how to keep you safe." "I'm not scared," Jake said with 8-year-old bravery that made her throat tighten. "Not as long as you're here." David knelt beside them, bringing himself to Jake's eye level again. "Your mother is going to help save a lot of people," he said seriously. "That makes you pretty important too. The son of a healer is always under special protection." Jake nodded solemnly, then looked back at Emily. "Will you teach me? About the healing?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of the fairy tales about people who could mend what was broken with nothing but touch and will. Rose Blackwood had never directly told Emily about her heritage, but she'd planted seeds, had prepared her granddaughter for this awakening even while keeping her safely hidden in the human world. "Maybe," Emily said carefully, "when you're older, when it's safe." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the pendant pulsing against her chest, and she wondered if safety was something they'd ever truly have again. The entity had retreated, but it hadn't been destroyed, and if its final warning was accurate, worse things were coming. Queen Seraphina gestured toward the chamber's entrance. "Your quarters are prepared, and food has been sent up. You'll need your strength for tomorrow's healing sessions." Emily started to follow, then stopped and turned back to the assembled nobles. They were still kneeling, still watching her with that mixture of hope and reverence that felt like a weight around her shoulders. "Get up," she said quietly. "All of you. I'm not your savior. I'm just someone with a gift that might help. But I can't do this alone." Lord Matthias rose gracefully, his earlier suspicion replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "What do you need from us?" Emily thought of the entity's malevolent intelligence, of the way it had used Lady Cordelia's body to test her abilities. "Information. About the poisoning patterns, about who was affected when and where. If these things have been planning this for months or years, there might be a way to track their movements, to figure out what they're really after." "Beyond the obvious goal of corrupting our entire species?" David asked grimly. Emily shook her head. "That wasn't the end goal, it was preparation. They've been testing vampire physiology, learning how to control your people, gathering intelligence about your kingdom's defenses and weaknesses." The certainty in her voice surprised her, but she knew she was right. This was reconnaissance for something bigger. The implications settled over the chamber like a shroud. If Emily was correct, if the poisoning had been preparation for a larger assault, then healing the affected nobles would only buy them time. The real battle was still coming, but as Emily looked around the chamber, at the hope in David's storm-gray eyes and the strength in Queen Seraphina's regal bearing, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her grandmother's death. She felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had a place in a world that had always seemed too big and too dangerous for someone like her. The pendant pulsed one final time against her chest, warm and reassuring, and Emily realized that her grandmother's fairy tales had been more than stories. They'd been promises. Promises that power would awaken when it was needed most, that purpose would reveal itself in the darkest hour, and that sometimes the most ordinary people were chosen for the most extraordinary destinies. She was Emily Blackwood, last of the Luminous Healers, And whatever ancient evils were stirring in response to her awakening, she would face them with everything her bloodline had given her. For Jake. For the vampire kingdom that had offered them protection. For the bridge between worlds that her ancestors had died trying to preserve. The healing would begin tomorrow. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be.